J.D.M, thanks so much for joining us in Hub Dialogues. How are you today?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be back here, Harrison.
Congratulations on the book. Since
Thank
we
you.
last talked, this hit the presses. It's now off the presses. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great about it. I think every author works hard for a couple of years and then the book comes out and it's probably one of the more exciting days in a year. So I'm very pleased.
Let's go back to a moment where you weren't feeling so jazzed. It was the moment that sparked this book. It was a moment that involved a young Canadian. Can you give our listeners a sense of what happened that made you think, I have to write a book about prime ministers because this country is greatly in need of this?
Right. So some of your listeners may know that I've spent 30 years as a teacher. So I was called in to give an address to a model United Nations group of high school students. And up on my screen, I had a picture of Lester B. Pearson, and it was labeled, "This is Lester B. Pearson," but I put out to the crowd, "Who is this man on the screen?" And I had a room full of silent students. They didn't know who Lester B. Pearson was to identify him as a Nobel Prize laureate or a former prime
Famed
minister.
diplomat.
Exactly.
You know, a key player when it came to the UN.
Right.
Like
one of the great Canadian figures of the 20th century. So I thought this is pretty unbelievable because it's a group of model UN students who probably should know. And so then I just thought, I need to do something more about this and decided that I would beaver away and write a book about the history of Canada's prime ministers.
Let me quote Pearson because you just mentioned him. This is from your last book, but I loved it so much I have to say it again.
Being prime minister.
Yes, being prime minister. Prime ministers require the hide of a rhinoceros, the morals of St. Francis, the patience of Job, the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the leadership of Napoleon, the magnetism of a beetle, and the subtlety of Machiavelli. Is there something that all these guys and one woman share from looking at all their history, writing about them, going through the archives? Is there something that, you know, a single strand that traveled through the ages?
It's a great question. And they share a few things. One of them is a passion for Canada. Number two is a capacity for hard work. So these are people who are highly motivated and willing to work hard to make the country a better place. And they also believe in Canada. And I know there's people out there who say so-and-so ruined the country or is trying to ruin the country, but prime ministers don't get up in the morning and think about how they can sink the country. They might have differing views on how to move the country forward, but they all share this passion for the country to make it a better place. They also, I wouldn't say, as Pearson says, you know, they have to have the hide of a rhinoceros. Some of them have pretty thin skin. We think about John Diefenbaker. He took criticism very, very strongly. So they are passionate and dedicated to the country. And I think that's probably their one unifying force. But when we think about they can be thin-skinned, though, to go back to Diefenbaker. And I'm just looking at the cover of the book, and I'm thinking, you know, Trudeau never liked criticism. Mulroney always had.
I was going to say, so I've read the Secret Mulroney tapes as of you, which was a look, you know, behind the curtain when it comes to how these guys, we're always talking about how we feel about them, but how do they feel about us on the outside? Which prime minister would you say wanted to be loved the most? That was desperate for that, you know, public adoration.
I mean, they all
want it.
Well, I'm not going to stop there because I do need to zero in on a couple of them. Obviously, Brian Mulroney really wanted to have the adoration of the public and cared about it deeply. And I would also say Mackenzie King, too. But a lot of that was private to him in his diary. He was he was bent out of place if someone didn't properly recognize him or give him praise or credit where he wanted.
He's like a little schoolgirl going back
a little
bit.
Yeah.
He glanced at me and there was something in his eyes.
That's right. That's right. So he was thin-skinned like that. And also John Diefenbaker certainly wanted his people who worked for him to show him loyalty and respect. And he definitely desperately wanted to be loved too. So this is part of what comes with politics. I think a lot of people thrive on public adulation, and Justin Trudeau would be one of those people too. He really thrived on that kind of even, I might throw the word narcissism out there too. So there is a certain element of that at some of the highest levels of politics. But then there's others who don't need it. Louis Saint Laurent. Louis Saint Laurent didn't care. I would say Stephen Harper didn't care that much either. So, but those would be more of the exceptions than those who are more likely to need it.
Do you have to be a narcissist to be prime minister? I often think, do you have to be a narcissist to be a politician? You've got a picture of your face on
Yeah.
someone's lawn. You're going door to door saying, this is why I should be your guy.
Mhm.
You know, you're on the cover of the policy book. Do you have to be kind of full of yourself to run for prime minister?
I don't think you have to. I might talk about the word ego instead of narcissism. Although some of our leaders have, fell into the narcissist aspect of it, but I would say you have to have a healthy ego to put yourself out there and to look for the public's adulation, and you do see yourself in the public eye all the time. So there's a certain amount of healthy ego that goes along with this for sure.
Let's get into the job. You talked about work. Tell me if I'm wrong here. It seems like some prime ministers like to really get in the weeds, get
Yeah.
down in the trenches, work on policy, focus on the numbers, the details. There's others that seem to see the role as sort of like a mascot figure, a figurehead for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you see that division when it comes to these fellows, and whether we're seeing more mascots these days as we get into the age of social media and this sort of stuff.
I think one former prime minister said to me that there were briefing book prime ministers and then the other ones. And there are briefing book prime ministers. Those are the ones who like to get deep into things. Stephen Harper is one of those. He was very detailed oriented and really mastered his brief. Brian Mulroney was another. Pierre Trudeau as well. In fact, most of them were of that ilk. R.B. Bennett, if we want to go a little bit deeper into history, R.B. Bennett, somebody once said of him that work was this man's play, and he would burn the midnight oil as a prime minister. But they all work hard, and the greatest premium in a prime minister's office is time. So there's not enough time to do the job. Other prime ministers, I haven't come across a lot of evidence that Justin Trudeau was a briefing book prime minister, and I'm not trying to say that he didn't work hard, because I'm sure that he did, but I'm not sure that he was looking at the job in the same way that some of his predecessors had.
I remember, I think it was during the foreign interference inquiry, it was kind of revealed that, yeah, he saw himself as a figurehead, and there was talk of, when it came to him at least, things details being worked out before he even had meetings. Like, he was sort of a rubber stamp. When you come in and you have a meeting with them, the specifics have basically been figured out ahead of time.
Yeah, it depends on the leader, and sometimes that's an efficient way to get things done. Some prime ministers will smartly take a few files and just say they're going to focus on these ones. So Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was famous for setting out priorities and working on them, but also allowing his cabinet ministers to run their offices. And really, since Jean Chrétien, cabinet government has kind of fallen away quite a bit. Justin Trudeau's cabinet ministers really weren't given the free rein. In fact, they could rarely get a meeting with him if they needed it right away. Whereas with Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, if a cabinet minister needed a meeting, they would get it as soon as possible. So there are these different ways of governing and using your cabinet, which is an important part of looking at a prime minister's work habits.
And these cabinet ministers were household names back in the day. They were lieutenants that people were aware of, right? Now, you see certain polling and people are not aware of who these people are.
And you had Andrew Coyne on your Hub Dialogues
Yes.
a few months ago, and he writes in his book about, in the old days, you would see all kinds of future prime ministers by looking at the cabinet of the prime minister, and we just don't see that today. In Pierre Trudeau's cabinet, for example, in Lester B. Pearson's cabinet, he had Pierre Trudeau. This is in 1965. He had Pierre Trudeau, John Turner, and Jean Chrétien.
There's a picture in your book, which I love, where you can see all of them together.
That's right.
Sort of gabbing it up and laughing.
Yeah.
And you just think, oh my gosh, there's the next few decades of
That's right.
the Canadian prime ministerialship, whatever we want to call it, right there. What do you think, through your research, is the biggest scandal that Canada's ever had when it comes to politics and prime ministers?
Well, I think the Pacific scandal is probably the biggest one, and that's 1873 with John A. Macdonald and the railway.
But he survives it.
He did. He lost government, so he paid a pretty big price.
But he comes back, yeah.
He comes back in 1878. He defeats Alexander Mackenzie's Liberals and comes back to office, which is partly for two reasons. One, Alexander Mackenzie was not the most effective prime minister. He wasn't really good at the retail side of politics and just didn't really enjoy being prime minister. And then when you put him up against Sir John A. Macdonald, who is a very skilled practitioner of retail politics, has a vision for the country more than Mackenzie did. Mackenzie was didn't really think the railway was the greatest idea. And so that Macdonald could wheel himself back into power with his sheer political talents. So the Pacific scandal, though, to get back to the question, was a pretty enormous scandal. And we've had others, but I'd say the Pacific scandal is certainly the biggest one.
Do you get the sense as well, and you've interviewed almost all the living prime ministers, you did this a few years ago,
Yeah.
that they were students of history themselves, that they looked back on their predecessors and said, oh, this scandal, this mistake, I will learn from said event as I go with my job today?
So when you are the prime minister, you're in a pretty exclusive club of now 24 people. And most prime ministers have a sense of history. And I think that's an important quality to have as a prime minister. And Stephen Harper, for example, was very interested in the history of John Diefenbaker, for example, how he ran his government. He really liked to look at the habits of Jean Chrétien as well, his predecessor, one of his predecessors. And so they all have this sense of history. And Mackenzie King as well, an important prime minister that we should not overlook because he was the country's longest serving prime minister. But he was completely enamored with Sir Wilfrid Laurier and how he lived, how he ran his government, and what he was as a prime minister. So you have to have a healthy sense of the country. If you're going to be prime minister, you better have a healthy sense of the country because it's important to see where we've been and where we want to go.
I think they keep mementos too, right? Like I think Trudeau had Laurier's pen, and I can't remember what's passed down on the
Yeah, well,
conservative side of things,
Chrétien was also a big admirer of Wilfrid Laurier. Not surprisingly, everybody admires Wilfrid Laurier. He was a great prime minister. But what Jean Chrétien has is a horseshoe tie pin that Wilfrid Laurier used to wear because he always famously wore this horseshoe tie pin because he believed in the good luck of it. And then in my book, I mentioned that when Louis Saint Laurent became prime minister, the caucus gave him a walking stick that used to belong to Laurier. So,
anything on the conservative side?
so I'm trying to think.
Token?
Yeah, John Diefenbaker was a huge admirer of Sir John A. Macdonald, and so his office was festooned with busts of Sir John A. Macdonald and other mementos of him. So, and Macdonald certainly lives on in that way. And I think Brian Mulroney had some kind of Macdonald memorabilia in his office because he really admired the fact that Macdonald won consecutive majority governments, and the only person to do it since Macdonald was Brian Mulroney.
You talk about winning government. The Liberal Party has governed for 87 of the last 129 years in this country. I looked it up. 62.5% of prime ministers have been Liberal. I don't know how I got 0.5%. Anyway, what does that tell us about this country and the makeup of it? And what message should conservatives take from that, having lost this past election after already 10 years of Liberal rule?
I think, they call the Liberal Party, as a lot of people listening will know, the natural governing party. And I think that the party has been skilled at going to where the voters are. The party has been very pragmatic in trying to maintain power. And each of those Liberal prime ministers, Mackenzie King, Laurier, Pierre Trudeau, they've all moved to where the votes are. And I would say the lesson for the Conservatives, and I think Brian Mulroney was one who was able to apply this, was to be pragmatic. If you put a little water in your wine, then you can win power. And in that book you spoke of earlier, the Secret Mulroney tapes, in the introduction to that, Peter C. Newman writes about how the secret to being a great prime minister is to be an ideological acrobat, to be able to square circles. You have to do that in Canada.
Can I give you the counter to that? Because a lot of conservatives would say it's so unfair to see Liberals lick their fingers, put it up to the wind, and seemingly change their opinions overnight
Right.
instead of being rooted to things and having, guiding moral lights that you follow no matter what. Maybe you a few tweaks here and there in terms of where you're going, but how infuriating it is, to see Carney win power, for example, and then talk about, we're helping Canadians. Look, we ditched the carbon tax. And you're like,
Right.
haven't we been hearing for the last 10 years that the Liberal carbon tax is the best thing since sliced bread? Like,
Yeah.
what do you make of that?
I mean, I can see how infuriating it would be for Conservatives to see the Liberals just do an about face. And I don't have the political answer to that, except I have the historical answer.
What's that?
Which is to say that the Liberals have been doing that throughout. The Mackenzie King famously stole the policies from the CCF. So Mackenzie King was able to modify his policies, and any successful political party has to do that. Look at the Conservatives under Brian Mulroney. First, they were opposed to free trade. Then they changed their mind and they said, we're in favor of free trade. So sometimes you just have to be, like Peter C. Newen was saying, you have to be an ideological acrobat and make some changes. There's certainly something to be said for being steadfast in your views, but you don't want to be so steadfast that you can't move and try to win power. So I think that's the difference.
And hope the electorate has a short memory.
Right, which they usually do.
Yeah. Did you come across with any of these fellows? I keep saying fellows. I sound like I'm some.
Well, we can talk about Kim
1700s or
Campbell if
something.
you want. But,
Yeah. But did any of these guys and women, did any of them leave power on their own accord, or were they all pushed out? It's a job that you're always forced out because at the end of the day, it's the best job you will ever have.
Right.
And that, the next day once you leave, there's not a driver pulling up to pick you up. There's not, a press gallery waiting, hanging on your every word.
Mhm.
Any of these fellows leave on their own accord, or did they all sort of knifed and pushed out the back?
Somebody once told me that nobody ever gives up power voluntarily, and it's always stuck with me because I think it's true. Being prime minister and having your hand on the levers of government is a intoxicating and great position to be in. So no prime minister has left on his or her own accord. They've either been defeated by the people in an election, or their own party has decided that it's time for a new leader, or sometimes people have died in office. So nobody leaves of their own accord because the job is too interesting.
And this is the thing in Canada, we don't have term limits. So you can have these interesting
Mhm.
moments where this person, like, how long was Mackenzie King in power again for?
21 years.
Like, think about that.
Yeah, I know.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, this is a really interesting study because that will never happen again. And one of the things in Mackenzie King's favor was there was a different media landscape where you were not in front of people all the time. Leaders today, they wear themselves out in the public eye.
They oversaturate.
Yeah,
this, yeah.
and that's just par for the course.
Before I go big picture here
Yeah.
and speak a little bit more about history, tell me about that intoxication. You mentioned this word intoxication,
Mhm.
and just like what it's like to occupy that role. You're in the
Right.
office. You're the person.
Right.
Can you describe what, like, the aura that comes with that, and
Mhm.
like when you speak to these folks, what it's like having that around you?
Well, I mean, the best person to ask that question to is probably someone who's served as prime minister, but you might not get the most honest answer from them. But I think when we talk about intoxication with the power, and by that I just mean it's a pretty energized thing to be able to get up in the morning and know that you can make a difference. So, Louis Saint Laurent, who was one of the less egoistic prime ministers, was asked after being prime minister in an interview, what was the great thing about being prime minister? And he said, well, it was having had the opportunity to make a difference. Pretty idealistic, but pretty true. Paul Martin, when asked about his time as prime minister, he said, it's so great because I can do more in 5 minutes as prime minister than I can do in something that will take me 6 months to do as a private citizen.
Yeah.
So there is the ability to make change and make things happen. And I think that's a pretty energizing way to go to work, knowing that you can make a difference every day. And many of these things, by the way, they're not the things that you read about in the newspaper. It may be something smaller that just happens in a local community. It may be something even smaller than that, where you make a phone call to someone who has just lost a child or something, and it's a bit of comfort coming in the form of a telephone call from a prime minister. So there's lots of things you can do because of the office.
What conclusions have you drawn in terms of, what we should be thinking about how history is created?
Mhm.
This idea of the great man theory of history. On your cover here, it says, Canada's leaders and the nation they shaped. They being like they have agency and they created the history that we now have.
Yeah.
Versus, sweeping social forces, structures,
Yeah.
the system as opposed to the man. Where do you sit between the system and the man in terms of how we should think what really
Right.
influences history?
Well, it won't surprise you that I lean towards the fact that leadership and those who occupy these offices are extremely important. I'm not going to dismiss the other sweeping parts of history that are enjoyable to study, but I don't think that means that we have to ignore history at the leadership level. And I think what's happening in a lot of historical conversations, even at the school level, is that people are thinking, well, we can't really teach about prime ministers because that's 24 white men plus Kim Campbell. And so people think that it's politically incorrect to do that. But that wasn't something that just happened. We still have to face up to the fact that these are the leaders who made decisions. These are leaders who were elected by the people of Canada. And the decisions that they made, like the subtitle of my book, they helped shape the nation. Some of those things were for the benefit of the country. Others of them were very controversial. But why wouldn't we study leadership at the highest level? This is part of what the country is. There's plenty of room to study other aspects of Canadian history. But studying Canadian history at the leadership level is extremely important because those decisions trickle down and affect everyone. So why wouldn't we? I think it's really important that we have a good understanding of the people who led the nation.
So where are we at when it comes to the teaching of history in this country, would you say?
Well, there's always room for improvement. And I know that on an individual basis, there's a lot of great history teachers who are doing their best to cultivate an interesting Canadian history in the provinces where it's taught, by the way, because in most of the provinces of Canada, you don't have the opportunity to teach a lot about Canadian prime ministers because there isn't a history class. There's a social studies class, which means you're teaching some geography, some economics, some civics in there. You don't really have a chance maybe to get deep down into leadership politics. So I think there's a lot more that we can do. And I think that having a book like this in the public domain is really important. And to that end, wouldn't it be great if every high school in the country decided that they needed to have this book in the library?
You're a biased messenger here, but
I mean,
it'd be great for your sales and it would be good because it is digestible in that here's a chapter about one guy and you've summarized it.
Right. But let me tell you, in my epilogue, I write about when I was a high school student and I picked up Lawrence Martin's book, The Presidents and the Prime Ministers. It was in my school library, A History of Canada's Prime Ministers and U.S. Presidents. And that was a book that really got me hooked on history. So it's important to have these things available for young people.
You often hear about these entry points, right? I'm sure you've spoken to successful people today in politics and they tell you, I picked up that book. I spoke to this person and that was this portal into the rest of my future.
Exactly. Yeah.
For me, it was civics class. Like I remember, and I had a really good civics teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's good to have, you need to have those moments. Where are we at, J.D.M, in this? We talked about this last time in terms of the pendulum swinging.
Mm-hmm.
We spent the last few years really, like you said, consumed with like righting the wrongs of history, going after often these powerful white men that make up our past and trying to count all their mistakes and how they're horrible, flawed, brutal, etc.
Yeah.
It's certainly, the pendulum has certainly swung back in America. Some would say too much, but where's the pendulum at here in Canada in terms of going back to more of a commemorating, celebratory understanding of our leaders in the past?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about using the word celebratory, but I think maybe if we think about a word of recognizing and discussing, if celebration, if necessary, but not necessarily celebration. And so where do I think the pendulum is? I think we're at a place now where we are more open to a balanced dialogue about Canadian history. We're not trying to shove one version of events and say this is the only way things can be. I think we may be more willing now to entertain that two things can be true at the same time. Johnny Macdonald can have done some regrettable things with his Indigenous policy, but he can also have been someone who built the nation and saw a railway through to completion. So we can look at our historical personalities and have a reasonable judgment about them without trying to drive some stake through the heart because they made a mistake that was something that was more indicative of the times in which they lived as opposed to our times right now.
Tell me if I'm wrong here. This is insight I've had over the last few years. Me and you are sort of obsessed with this stuff, and we focus on it a lot.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why we felt so frustrated over the last few years when we felt these guys were being unfairly treated. They can't defend themselves. They're long gone.
Right.
The people who were toppling the Ryerson statue going after Macdonald here at Queen's Park, they were very loud a few years ago, and they were very angry, and they accomplished a lot of things on their end. I don't really hear from them that much anymore, and I wonder, I'm like, is this lost interest? Was it just fashionable at the time for them to do these things? In my mind, this is being a bit harsh, but like, were they just tourists? Because like we're immersed in the stuff. We really care. We've sort of done our homework. Were they just kind of dipping in and then dipping out? Or are there people still that are like, I don't know, maybe frustrated by that balance you're talking about and are still quite vocal? I don't really hear from them. Do you?
Yeah, it's, I think that whole 2020, 2021 period was a moment in time where there was public space for all of this anger and pent up unhappiness with various things. Even the pandemic may have played a part of this. And it was a very emotional time. And I think, emotions like anger, well, any emotion, they just last for a moment. Anger passes, joy passes. And so I think the anger has passed. And now we are looking at these things under a new light, a rational light, an unemotional light. And so I think the people who were really upset, they've retreated. They've had their voices heard. And now we're willing to have more nuanced debates. Although the interesting thing is you don't really hear people who are on the other side of this issue from you and me. You don't really hear them wanting to get involved in debates. So they don't want to have a discussion based on the facts. They've had their piece and they've moved on now, because I do find it interesting that we're not having debates. It's more like people on my side of the argument are having their voices heard now, but no one wants to have the debate one-on-one, which, I'm willing to do.
Why do you think that is? It's like almost like to not agree with their side of the argument is like harmful in a way, or to acknowledge yours is,
I don't know.
What is it?
I don't know. I think that these kinds of debates have become fraught with, if I disagree with you, then you're going to cast aspersions on me, and I don't want to have that happen in a public forum. So it's actually part of the whole. We've lost the ability to have good debates, I think, in our society right now. A lot of it is happening on social media, which there's no engagement. It's just two ships passing in the night. And so it's too bad we don't have the same long form forum to have some of these contentious discussions. But there's always a risk involved. There's a risk that people will classify you as, they might even say, well, maybe you're racist or something. Who wants to expose themselves to something like that?
Where are we at with the current prime minister? He's there on the bottom right, in terms of how much, do we know how much he cares about this stuff? We saw when he assembled his cabinet after the election, he gave this quite interesting speech that had all these historical references about founding peoples and the importance of our history. And, he goes off to England and meets with the king, and I think he's making signals perhaps that he's moving away from, post-nationalist messaging from Mr. Trudeau a few years ago.
Yeah.
What do you make of it? Is there something
it's
there?
still, it's early to tell. I appreciated the trips to London and Paris and then to Iqaluit on the way home. So he's talked about, the founding nations in Canadian history. But I haven't heard a huge number of historical references, but I know Mark
And has
Carney.
he done anything? Like,
Well, and
when it comes to archive,
we're going to find
history and
out. We're going to
archives?
find out soon because when the budget comes out, where's the money going in terms of history? I don't know what's going to happen there, but right now it's too early to tell how much Mark Carney loves Canadian history, how much he loves looking at the history of his predecessors. But hopefully he does understand that seeing what his predecessors have done is a surefire way to help guide him in his future as prime minister.
Mm-hmm. Because the country's been through a hell of a lot more than
Yeah.
just a trade war, right?
Right. I'd love to know who his
Actual
favorite
wars.
prime minister is because, all of them generally end up having a favorite. So it'd be fun to sit down with him sometime and hear what he thinks about Canadian history and the previous occupants of the office.
We'll know, if he changes the name of said office back to Lavalin Block or something. That could be
Langevin,
interesting.
yeah. That would be good. I don't think he's going to do that, though.
Yeah, that might be a bridge too far for him. Let's end on this. It's something else I've been sort of obsessed with over the last few years. In the early 2000s, Prime Minister Chrétien designated Ottawa's former railway station as Canada's future museum of political history. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. There might be something there. And maybe we'll get prime ministerial libraries. In the
Right.
States, every president gets a library. It's based at a university, a place close to the president's heart.
Yeah.
And in doing so, instead of having like fragmented bits of history, you get that person's tenure, all the archives and moments that came with their time in office. I don't know if you visited any of these libraries. I visited a few in the States.
Yeah.
Why don't we have this in Canada? And do you ever think there'll be enough momentum to get something like this here?
Well, it's interesting you asked this because I was having a conversation with another Canadian historian just yesterday talking about why don't we have a Prime Minister's Institute, something that can run conferences once a year to study a prime minister or an issue that involves prime ministerial leadership, a place to collect thoughtful papers on prime ministerial leadership and history, a place for even archival material. So it's a hole in our political history and in the caretaking of the Canadian story. So it's something that needs to be done. And it's something that I'm actually giving a fair bit of thought to of, who are some like-minded persons who would like to work with me to try to develop an institute for the study of Canadian prime ministers, because it is something that would help us understand the country better. And we've got lots of smart people in the country who know a lot about the history of our prime ministers, and we could bring this more to the public face and help us understand the country better.
That's a shout out for anyone that's listening.
It certainly is.
Come help J.D.M make that a reality. I think it'd be interesting because you talk about breaking down into decision making. There's nothing better than like having the memo in front of you, sitting in the actual desk they use. Anyway, I'm imagining.
But you would also have great debates too, and that's part of learning through debate and dialogue.
Mm-hmm. I can only imagine what Trump's presidential library is going to be. My gosh.
Yeah.
Just so viewers know that museum that was supposed to happen in the 2000s ended up, being a vacant railway building, and now I think it's where the Senate is being held
the Senate is, yeah.
during renovations. So we still do not have this library, this museum. So we'll be waiting.
We could put it would be a good use for 24 Sussex Drive. If they don't want to remake it into a prime ministerial residence, that would be a perfect place to house a museum and an institute for the study of.
And J.D.M and I will fumigate it and get rid of the thousands of rats trapped within the walls.
That's right.
Beforehand. Okay, well, thank you very much, J.D.M. It's a great book. Everyone should pick it up. It is called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. And we thank J.D.M for joining us here today on Hub Dialogues. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
This video is brought to you by Airbnb. This month, Airbnb is a sponsor of the Hub's YouTube channel. Governments are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis. But when they spend time restricting short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what's most important. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could potentially become long-term homes amounts to only 0.6% of Canada's housing stock. Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability, and a closer look clearly shows that building more housing, not restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. To learn more, go to airbnb.ca.